Hello, everyone. It's really great to be here and to be able to talk to you about getting ready for the quantum era. If we sort of step back and think about it, it's really quite an amazing achievement that we even have a global telecommunication system, the one that we have today. We take our most precious information assets, we entrust its confidentiality, its integrity, its availability to systems we don't really control, and where many adversaries have many different ways to get access to this platform. So how is it that this even works, right? How can this be secure? How can we trust such what at the surface would seem like an untrustworthy platform? Well, cryptography is the magic really that makes that possible, or that is at the foundation of making it possible. We have symmetric key agreements, right, that establish symmetric keys, which we can use to encrypt information, right? And so that encrypted information that's being transmitted looks unintelligible to an adversary that's looking at it. And that key agreement, it's even possible to do in a public setting where you just communicate openly, authentically, but openly, and establish a shared secret, which you can then use for encryption. And we use public key cryptography also to authenticate who we're talking to and validate that the information hasn't changed. Right? And all of these solutions, well, many of these solutions are what we call computationally secure, which means in principle, they could be broken with enough computational power using the best known algorithms, but they would take an astronomical amount of time, right? Effectively forever, thousands, millions of years, maybe more. Again, that's assuming the best known algorithms. Is it possible that new algorithms get discovered that make them breakable in a short amount of time? Yes, it occasionally has happened, right? But for most, day-to-day applications, this has actually worked really quite well and has provided a very strong layer of security that is very practical to deploy, and again, helps us achieve many business functions and other important functions in a way that is very secure in practice, right? Well, but then along comes quantum, right? So again, this security of today's codes have been battle tested against the strongest computing platforms that we have today, cloud computing, supercomputers, neuromorphic computing, and so on. These are all effectively classical platforms. Then along comes quantum mechanics, quantum computing, and for certain problems, there seems to be this exponential advantage if you harness quantum bits, if you harness bits in a quantum mechanical way, right? So if you want to, why do we think that? Because if you try to simulate 10 quantum bits on a regular computer, you have to keep track of 2 to the 10 quantum amplitudes. That's not so bad. That's 1,024 numbers. But if it's 20 bits, it's over a million numbers. And if it's a few hundred quantum bits, which is a really small number of bits, then there isn't enough matter in the known universe to keep track of the quantum of a classical description of that quantum mechanical system. In other words, if you try to get a regular classical computing platform to simulate even a few hundred quantum bit quantum computer, there isn't enough matter in the known universe to do that, right? In general, which means trying harder, throwing more money at it isn't going to work, right? But can these computers do something useful, right? Can they break these codes? So with such a powerful new platform, a bit unpredictable what exactly it will be good for, but where it can, where this quantum hammer is applicable, the impact could be astronomical advantage, right? With something that potentially powerful, you don't want to be caught off guard, right? Disruption is great if you're the disruptor. It's not so fun if you're being disrupted, right? So you want to, with such a disruptive technology, of course, we mean disruptive in really in a positive way, that it can enable things real game-changing new capabilities, you of course need to keep an eye on the technology, understand what it's capable of. Again, that understanding keeps evolving, of course, and follow the readiness levels of this new technology. Then you want to understand, and again, this is an ongoing process, what does this new capability mean to me, to my organization, to my sector, to my country? And as you continually update this understanding, you develop and evolve your plan to benefit from these disruptive capabilities. And of course, we have to understand and mitigate any threats that are intrinsic with quantum technology. A really critical point here, especially with preparing our digital platforms to be secure in the quantum era, is most of the execution of a strategy is really planning. It's preparing, right? Getting your supply chain ready, understanding the possible vendors, getting that ecosystem ready. There is, the doing part, that more, clear, visceral, deployment stage, for example. But you're not really going to be ready for that if you don't do all that planning. There's no shortcut. There's no hitting the pause button to do the planning you wish you had done. So the preparation part of all this is really important. So why are we so confident that quantum advantage really exists in practice and can have this really game-changing impact on some computational problems of interest? Because we saw it happen back in 1994, at least in principle, before the quantum computers were available. Right, in 93, we thought today's public key cryptography, RSA-based, discrete log-based, including elliptic curve cryptography, we weren't aware of any impact of quantum computing on breaking those codes. But then in 1994, thanks to Peter Shor's algorithms, those codes were completely broken. And to be clear, going to bigger key lengths is not going to help very much, right? Normally, if the code is just kind of slightly broken, you go to a slightly bigger key length and you'll be fine. But this was broken very badly. There's no asymptotic difference between using the code and breaking it. So you really need a new algorithm. Easier said than done, right? And a really important point to make is, back in the 90s, we always knew maybe smart mathematician breaks one of these codes, but if they break RSA, we still have discrete logarithm based. If they break the discrete log system, we still have RSA. But of course, Peter Shor's algorithms broke both of them, right? So it broke plan A and the backup plan, which is an important lesson to keep in mind as we go forward. Next time, we might not be so lucky. Now, what does this mean in practice, that these codes will someday be broken? What happens if they're broken and we aren't ready? How bad would that be? We're already this is already one of the top 10 threats, right, to the world, according to the World Economic Forum and many others, right, is all cybersecurity, all these cyber attacks, denial of service, ransomware, spyware, right, stealing of data, it's for sale on the dark web, shutdown of infrastructure we've been seeing on a regular basis the last short number of years. All of these very, in some cases, quite devastating attacks, which just keep getting worse, are enabled by, right, they somehow take advantage of a vulnerability. And the most typical vulnerabilities are the more mundane ones, like a user clicking on a link they shouldn't click on. I'm not criticizing users. Like, humans are going to be human. We need to design systems that are more resilient against humans falling prey to, honestly, increasingly sophisticated and hard to discern, phishing attacks and other attacks, or bad, password, or default passwords and bad patch management, right? Or if there's an insider, that can be more devastating. As you go up this array of vulnerabilities, the impact of these vulnerabilities become more systemic and harder to remediate. So they're all serious, right? Because the ones at the bottom happen a lot, but they tend to be more random, and we're used to detecting and remediating. The ones closer to the top, less often, but when they happen, they can be very systemic and not easy to remediate. Implementation errors, we know how to fix the implementation error, but it can take months and months to deploy it across a full software stack. Design error, much worse, because then you need a new design. If you had one waiting and ready to deploy, if you have agility, you can be more resilient, you can be more ready. But if you don't, it can be a very, very dangerous situation. And I put this at the top of the stack where if your cryptography is broken, because the same cryptography is used across many platforms, it's even more systemic, right? And even really harder to design replacement if you don't have one ready. So again, we have to deal with all of this. Today, we generally deal with the ones we haven't yet really seen a major attack enabled by vulnerable cryptography, because we've been lucky, really. But if we ever do, in many ways could be much, much worse than anything we've ever seen, depending on a lot of the details, of course. So how soon do we need to act to protect against this additional vulnerability? Again, to be clear, it's not like if we had unbreakable cryptography, we'd have no problems. No, actually, we'd still have all the problems I listed here, right? So this is just in addition to what we already have to manage. We also need to mitigate this very profound and systemic problem. How soon? Well, it depends. Okay. You have to go through, you have to look at the fundamental equation of quantum risk management and ask yourself, how many years does my data need to be secure? Call that X. Right? X could be 0 years in many cases, or sometimes it's maybe 7 or 8 years according to regulatory requirements. Some cases decades or the lifetime of a person and so on. So that varies. You might have several different X parameters within an organization. And secondly, you have to ask yourself, what's the migration time, right? How long will it take me to migrate the current way of doing things to new systems and practices that will be resilient to the known quantum attacks? Call that Y years. How many years or decades in some cases will that take to do properly? And then lastly, how many years before quantum computers, cryptographically relevant quantum computers, get into the hands of the threat actors you're worried about? And in your quantum risk analysis, we'll go through what are your likely threat actors and when they're likely to get access, right? And the thing is, for the next Y years, until you finish that migration, all your communications could be recorded or harvested for later exploitation. Right. So we're creating more debt here, right? We're digging a bigger hole. We're communicating with methods we know could be recorded for future exploitation. But we don't have a choice at this point, right? Because it takes time to migrate, right? And then those last few encryptions are supposed to be secure for X years. And if a quantum computer can break these codes in less than X plus Y years, you're already risking losses, right? You're already risking for that. Like what are you going to do at the end of that, just before that migration is done, right? Those messages could be decrypted before they're supposed to. Now, if Y is less than Z, I'll get to that. That's an even, bigger problem. But you ideally want to avoid X plus Y, being greater than Z with any significant probability for any system of substantial value. So what does it really mean if we're too late here? Well, for one, if Y is less than Z, right? If Z is less than Y, so if the threats are real, say 2 years before your migration is done, we have a problem. Like those critical infrastructures may fail, right? And there's no quick fix. So obviously you want to make sure Y is Z for any important infrastructure, right? One we really don't want to be without, one where we don't have some sort of plan to keep it running. Of course, if X plus Y is bigger than Z, right, then data might not remain confidential over the time period it's supposed to because of harvest now, decrypt later. Some people, I think, in the back of their mind says, look, if quantum computers start really, as we get close to a cryptographically relevant quantum computer, I'll just go faster. You can't really rush rebuilding the building blocks of cybersecurity. You can try, but apart from being expensive and disrupting your business, because now it's a big firefight, it's a big crisis management. So all the other things you're doing, have to, in some cases, get paused, or at least some of them. You're going to make a lot of mistakes, which hackers love. They love it when you make mistakes. You make design errors. Design errors are great, are the best, right? Implementation errors are pretty good too, right? They're very good at exploiting all these things. We really want to avoid that. We don't want to have to try to compress why. There's also, systems often fail when people just lose confidence in them, right? So even if the cyber attacks aren't happening, if people are seriously worried about cyber vulnerabilities, they're going to be less willing or ready to trust the platforms, right? Which can have all sorts of negative consequences for us. It's really a lost opportunity when you can't trust a platform that could really create a lot of value for us. Another unfortunate side effect for anyone hoping to take advantage of, happy quantum, of the positive applications of quantum computing, is if we haven't first mitigated the threat that quantum computers pose, there's going to be really intense controls on getting access to quantum computers. They're not going to work perfectly, right? Hackers will still get access to quantum computers. It'll just be harder for them to do it, but the harder we make it for criminals, the harder and more expensive it's going to be for people trying to actually design better materials to reduce our energy consumption, to design better drugs and better OLEDs and whatever. They're going to have a harder time getting access to these things, these quantum computers. Again, sole adversaries, but they will get in. They just have to work a little harder to bypass the controls. And again, another thing we have to, again, not forget is, just like there's been a number of breaks in cryptographic algorithms over the years. And so this could happen again. So for really critical systems, there's a risk that these upgraded algorithms that we're working on could be mathematically broken. If we're using algorithms that are not information theoretically secure, which we do because they're really great, they're very functional, and we know how to deploy them properly, but there's still a risk that they're broken. So what do we need to do there? Well, let's have that agility. Let's have that backup plan ready to go, or deployed, or at least close to deployment, so we can easily swap things in. Let's have defense in depth. So hopefully not all the defenses are broken at the same time. And let's make methods not susceptible to cryptanalysis as practical as we realistically can. So there's at least we can decide for more important systems and assets to have methods that are not susceptible. And again, there already are an entire class of systems, of government systems, for example, where it's not allowed to use things like asymmetric key agreement. So what else could use would benefit from solutions that aren't susceptible to or less susceptible to mathematical cryptanalysis? An important point is our luck may run out, because the cryptographic breaks we've seen to date in the modern era of cryptography either weren't feasible in the short term, right? It was like in 1994, yes, quantum computers can break RSA and ECC. That would have been really bad if that was on a classical computer available at the time, but it wasn't. It was on this quantum computer, which at the time I thought was a joke. When I realized they were serious, I thought, well, this is like the most ridiculous thing I'd ever heard of. Eventually, I realized I was wrong, but it was decades into the future. I knew it would be at least more than 20 years into the future. And there's been things like the break of SHA-1, which was not immediately implementable. And it gave us time to deploy SHA-2 and SHA-256, right? At least have it ready. Even for people who said, oh, I'm going to wait. When these hash collisions were found, the solution was standardized, deployed. It was really a relatively short journey for those who really wanted it. I know that's oversimplified. Talk to anyone in a bank. It's not a short journey, but you're way ahead in that journey if the algorithm exists, has been standardized and deployed, and your problem is just implementing it in your platforms. You've done a lot of that 90% of the work. and you're really into that 10% of deployment. The other reason we've been lucky with cryptographic breaks is some of the breaks have been on algorithms that were not deployed or not deployed widely. And two recent examples were two of the shortlisted NIST algorithms were broken a few months ago. You could break them on a classical computer in a short, like 2 days or so. In some cases, maybe even worse. But these weren't deployed. They were the shortlisted candidates. They hadn't been chosen yet, but getting a bit uncomfortable, let's say, that algorithms that were scrutinized by many of the world's best cryptographers, right, were broken. And again, this was solid work, to be clear. This wasn't careless work. This was solid work, but that's part of the risk we take when we work on these algorithms. And that's why we went through this process. That's why we want more than one algorithm, and so on. And another important point to make is even if 20 years ago we were unlucky and public key cryptography was shattered, it would have been bad, but it's a lot worse now. It's really, you look at any critical infrastructure, directly or indirectly, it'd be very negatively impact availability, and other security features would be negatively impacted systemically if public key cryptography is broken. So we really don't want to be too cavalier with the risk of public key cryptography being broken. And again, I'll reiterate it later. I absolutely believe we should be deploying post-quantum cryptography as broadly and ubiquitously as we can. It's a really important part of the ecosystem, and I'll elaborate a bit more on why later on. So what do you do to get ready? Well, part of prioritizing what you do, I mean, in an ideal world, you might say, well, just migrate to quantum safe cryptography as soon as possible, get it over with. That's not so easy for a large enterprise, for an entire digital ecosystem. So you often have to prioritize along, there's so many other decisions business leaders have to make, and forget about even just outside of cybersecurity, but even within cybersecurity, there's so many competing priorities. Why should we spend resources on this migration, not just wait a little longer, right? So quantum risk is for those organizations that don't have the ability to just pull the trigger and migrate. This helps you understand and prioritize which systems are especially vulnerable and should be addressed first. And in many cases, uncover quantum vulnerabilities you hadn't realized existed. And this is a combination of looking at processes, tools, and so on. Maturity of the organization to be able to undergo a cryptographic migration is all part of a full quantum risk assessment. There's a growing list of quantum best practices out there, and many of them are quite good. This is one example we've been working on in Canada with it's a quantum readiness working group of the Canadian Forum for Digital Infrastructure Resilience. And we've been working for several years now with major IT players in Canada, and this includes many multinationals with a strong Canadian presence, as well as our financial sector in Canada, including the Bank of Canada, our central bank, and then most of the largest banks in Canada, which are actually among the largest banks in the world. So we've been working through a lot of the best practices around the world, compiling them, adding to them, structuring them, and then sharing them back so all critical infrastructures could have a more refined, more developed starting point. And roughly, our findings were quantum readiness, the timetable can kind of be broken into two parts. There's a planning scoping stage, which, ideally you would have started by 2021 is in this, as we illustrate in this diagram, in getting the team together, scoping things, preparing, discovering not just your cryptography, but obviously tools for discovering where your cryptography is and how it's used are a really important part of this, valuable part of this. Doing a risk assessment, following obviously the threat, but also the solutions, and testing, looking at interoperability, identifying gaps in standards, right? Work backwards from where you need to be, and what are the biggest gaps that will take time to fill, and let's come up with a plan for doing it. And again, testing and performance analysis and so on is a big part of this planning phase. And then around 2025 or so, you can more aggressively move into implementing the plan. As tools, standards become available, you can get into that deployment phase. And of course, validation as well. And the regulators will be an increasing part of the process as time goes on as well. Again, the sooner you start figuring out this plan and this roadmap, the more informed, the more aligned regulatory frameworks can be with actually making things better. We don't want last minute knee-jerk reactionary regulations. That will not be good. So the more we can prepare and have an informed conversation about what should be required of people, and I mean regulation in the very broad sense. It doesn't necessarily have to be some heavy-handed prescriptive regulation. It can be the form of guidance and other sorts of policies to move us toward a better quantum safe posture. Everyone's journey is going to be different, right? There's going to be a lot of commonalities. That's why it's helpful to share best practices and make sure your entire ecosystem, including your supply chain and third parties, are as aligned as we can be. There's going to be gaps, but we want the gaps to be gaps. We don't want the whole, it to be one big gap with a few building blocks. We want, it to be mostly developed with a few gaps we could, fill in on the fly for the things we maybe missed or didn't quite get right initially. I want to flag, because a lot of people ask, occasionally we've had a few, let's say, false alarms, and we've moved as quickly as we can to let people know, don't panic, right? There have been some announcements, maybe this quantum algorithm or this classical algorithm could break these things in the very, very short term. We don't want panic. Panic is bad, or it leads to rushed, bad implementations. But we do want, it is a signal that this is all logically possible. It's just not likely the case with the recent announcements, right? But it could have been. So we really, this is an example of where this quantum threat and this requirement to implement new cryptography, have agility, look at solutions that maybe aren't susceptible to cryptanalysis, is all something we really should have been doing anyway, because a classical attack could potentially break these systems without a quantum computer. And we're not as ready as we really should be for that, partly because of inertia. In the 90s, maybe we were ready enough. And then we kept increasing the stakes, but the tools for protecting against these increased stakes were not proportionately more robust, let's say. So things you should be tracking, again, these things could unexpectedly happen, right? And we need to continually track. We've been living with this risk all along of just unexpected cryptanalytic advances. The path we know will break quantum computers is building logical, fault-tolerant logical qubits, integrating a small, a few thousand of them, around 4,000 for RSA, a similar but maybe smaller number for ECC of comparable bit strength, right? And it's so achieving, scalable fault-tolerant logical qubits is really an important milestone along the known path to a cryptographically relevant quantum computer. Again, could some other unexpected path get us there? Of course, right? That's background risk we continue to monitor, but the known path is through logical fault-tolerant quantum computing. And these are 3-year-old announcements, but if you're following the research, you'll see, again, first of all, IBM's still talking about 1,000 qubits in 2023, 3 years later. And there's been progress along illustrating logical error rates that are a little bit better than the physical error rates in the research literature across the globe. So we're continually seeing real progress toward these fault-tolerant logical qubits. And, when will quantum computers break RSA 2048? It's a constantly moving target. On the one hand, computer scientists and cryptanalysts are reducing the quantum requirements for doing the cryptanalysis, and people building quantum computers through better you can have lower error rates, better architectures, better error correcting codes, right? That makes things more available. Combination of more available and fewer resources required. When are those two lines going to cross over? It's a really hard thing to estimate, right? So, I have my own methodology and estimates, but in recent years, we've been going to dozens of the world's top experts, the ones who understand the challenges and generally have a track record of under-promising and over-delivering, understand, and we ask them a specific question, because you can't ask a vague question like, oh, when do you think we're going to have a quantum computer? What does that mean? Like, we have them already. Or when do you think we'll have a useful quantum computer? Well, what do you mean by useful? So we're very specific here. And furthermore, don't ask when do you think we'll have one, because with certainty, with 50% probability, 80%, 1%, like, we need to be specific. So, all right, people can really focus their mind on when do you think there'll be a 5%, or let's actually reverse the question, but it's effectively taking us to the same place. What is the likelihood of a cryptographically relevant quantum computer in 5 years? Less than 1%, right? 1 to 5%, 5 to 30%, right? 30 to 70%, and so on. In 5 years, in 10 years, in 15 years, taking into account all these amazing challenges, of course, most people say in 5 years, probably not, like really, really likely not. But is it a 1 in a million, 1 in 1,000, 1 in 5, what is it? Because that matters. Is it, you wouldn't bet your life on it, right? So, and if you average sort of the lower the lower ranges, the lower end of those ranges, you get 1%. And if you average the higher end, you get 6%. So, if they were to actually have picked the number in those ranges, it'd be somewhere between 1 and 6% in the 5-year horizon. So again, probably not, right? We're not saying, oh, it's going to happen in 5 years. We're saying probably not, but according to these experts, and I'm in that range, a 1 to 6%, probably not. Is that an acceptable risk? For certain systems, it's never been an acceptable risk, and they were never dependent on asymmetric cryptography, which are global payment systems. Is that an acceptable risk? Right? Is it an acceptable risk for our global telecommunication systems or not? Or do we need a mitigation plan for at least part of the systems, right? To at least be able to keep the lights on and so on, literally and figuratively. 10 years, between 10 and 27% is what the averages are. So it's hard to imagine an important digital platform where we're okay with a 10 to 27% chance of a systemic breakdown of our trust in those systems. So the availability, confidentiality, integrity of that information, or control of the systems. We're also in an IoT world and cyber physical systems, implanted medical devices. So it's not just about secrets or ledgers being tainted. It's about much, much more, and continuing to be more critical, right? More control of more vital systems where there's less human intervention to even notice if something's going wrong. So we definitely want to get ahead of this. Well, I think most experts agree, this isn't alarmist in the sense that this is going to happen in 10 years. Most people are not saying it's super likely, but it's not super unlikely in 10 years. So we need a plan. We need to be ready for that day. If 9 years from now, it's apparent we're at least another 5 years away, there's certain we can slow down. We don't necessarily have to finish that 10% deployment, but we need to be in a position where we have the option to, as we approach that 10-year mark or sooner for a really critical system. So fortunately, in theory, we know what to do about it, right? We can fix it. And the obvious path is deploy new mathematical algorithms that can't be broken by quantum computers. Of course, we don't know for sure they can't be broken, but at least they can't be broken by known quantum attacks. And there's a very elegant and sophisticated and deep tradition in tradecraft to give us confidence that these new methods are probably not susceptible by quantum computers, at least for large enough key lengths. So it's a very profound discipline that gives us these new post-quantum algorithms. But quantum also gives us new tools to add to the tool chest, right? Quantum random number generators and quantum key establishment, or QKD, quantum key distribution as it's known, right? These are, again, upgraded, new versions of existing tools, as well as fundamentally new tools. Key agreement without a math assumption, without a computational assumption. That's a wonderful thing in theory. To make the world a better and safer place, we need to deploy it in practice and deploy it well, right? So again, quantum key distribution, beautiful thing, right? No, it takes, in some sense, one of the weakest links in our cryptographic tool chest, because key agreement in a public key setting requires a trapdoor predicate, which is sort of somewhat rich mathematical structure, which is proven to be quite hard to find. We have found a few very promising instances, but not a lot of them, right? So being able to replace this most risky, in some sense, math tool with something that can't be cryptanalyzed is a wonderful thing, right? If we can achieve it in practice. And it really comes down to a trade-off between risk and convenience or ease of deployment. And we don't have to pick just one or the other for our ecosystem. We need these tools in the tool chest. And when you go architect a solution, you have to decide, what's the risk profile? Is good enough security good enough? In many cases, it is. Like AES, for example, Advanced Encryption Standard, requires a secure one-way function assumption, sort of cryptographically, which is a pretty modest assumption, let's say, in cryptographic terms, complexity theoretic terms. But if we're really thinking about long-term plus 20 years security or really super low risk, then there is the one-time pad, right? Properly implemented and so on, doesn't have a math assumption, but it's much harder to deploy, right? So really depends on how secure you want to be, what your risk tolerance is, whether it's worth that extra effort. Of course, you could also rekey more often, which has some degree of risk reduction if using AES. So there are some trade-offs in between. When it comes to key establishment, again, public key cryptography, a beautiful solution. It has, in some sense, the strongest mathematical assumption, at least of the cryptographic primitives I've been talking about, because you need these secure trapdoor predicates. But it's so convenient to use because it has, in some sense, minimal external dependencies. It's a simple, relatively simple code. I know we're oversimplifying. It's not that simple. It really takes very, very trained, experienced experts to properly implement it. But there's years of tradecraft in doing that. And it really lives inside protocols like TLS with minimal external dependencies, apart from things like a certificate authority. But there has to be some external anchor, right? Whereas much more secure methods like using pre-shared keys and trusted couriers, they also come with different kinds of risks, but they're also not that easy to deploy. And QKD is another way where there's no computational assumption. Less risk, in a sense, at least less cryptanalytic risk. There might be other risks, and ideally you want your risks to kind of be complementary to each other. So when you layer things, it's really hard to really penetrate all the layers. What we want is frameworks for making these less risky solutions easier to deploy. And that's where we have introduced the notion of a quantum delivery network to make QKD deployable, scalably, interoperably, and so on, to make it a much easier thing to integrate into platforms. Authentication, even more complicated, but again, there's these beautiful public key methodologies and really efficient ones relying on trapdoor predicates, and still reasonably efficient public key based ones that rely on a much less risky computational assumption, hash functions, and then there's other methods that rely on symmetric key, or in some cases even information theoretically secure. So there's a rich list of alternatives that we can build from and design systems that suit our security needs and our risk tolerances. And in closing, it's really critical I think for anyone overseeing a digital platform or using a really critical system that uses digital platforms, of course they all do, to start their journey today. Because again, you won't be able to make up lost time. You really, really want to manage this through technology lifecycle management. It's cheaper, it's better, right? And if you don't start, eventually you'll be managing it as a crisis. So we want to avoid crisis management because we still have the option right now of technology lifecycle management. Really, let's just make this a low cost transition, low drama transition, right? We have that choice, so let's do it and really make the foundation stronger than it otherwise would have been. If we manage it as a crisis, it likely will end up weaker than it currently is. So this requires organizations to establish quantum readiness teams, like serious ones, not, in your spare time, the enthusiasts can just do whatever and we'll tolerate it kind of thing. It now has to be dedicated resources. Their KPIs are tied to delivering an effective quantum readiness plan, right? Their board of directors, the C-suite, they have to assure themselves that their organization is going to manage this through technology lifecycle management, not crisis management. There's lots of best practices now you can leverage, and as you learn things, contribute it back. Because you might learn things specific to your sector or might uncover a gap that others hadn't uncovered yet because they didn't do enough, case studies. Support, in the quantum era, we really have to take a use it or lose it mentality. There's great companies, there's startups, and there's entrepreneurship in large companies and entrepreneurship in small companies. They create value for organizations because they help us get quantum ready. Again, that is real value creation. So of course, you should pay them, and it's a synergistic situation because these organizations, again, whether it's a project within a large organization or a startup, they're a critical part of translating the quantum opportunity, the quantum safe opportunity, and the quantum opportunity into reality. So we need to engage them, help them find product market fit, and be there for us as we need them, right? And help us test solutions. And in some cases, you might look at your XYZ and say, we need to mitigate this now. So while of course we prefer standardized solutions, you can always, there are standardized frameworks for taking a standardized solution and combining it with a new, maybe more experimental solution in a way where you don't jeopardize the security of the status quo, but you're at least getting the best available security and ready to upgrade it to the standardized solution as the standards become ready, right? And this is in situations where your own risk analysis says, look, we're uncomfortable just accepting this risk. It's worth the investment to layer in this additional layer of security as standards and other methods and certifications continue to evolve. So there's no, everyone, you're responsible for managing your own risk. Okay. So if your own risk calculation says you want to do something now, there are solutions you could deploy now. Again, don't stop using the standardized methods, but there are, again, standardized ways to combine additional keys in with certified keys and still maintain your certifications. Again, engage with the broader ecosystem, including your supply chains, as well as third parties, standards bodies, regulators, so you can proactively identify key challenges, because they'll often they're not super hard, but they'll take time. So you have to start early and help identify and work on these challenges together. So it's really been a pleasure to speak here today. Please feel free to reach out to me or anyone on our team if you have any further questions. I wish you a great day.